Hey, it's Mike here, and today we're doing a Veaction to Jordan Peterson on the food pyramid here. And I've heard it called Jordan Peterson destroys the food pyramid somewhere. I don't know if they changed the name or what happened, but we're gonna be responding to that video. And I will say, and you might notice I'm blue because I have these blue highlights on me. I'm recording my camera as a webcam, and I left the sharpening highlight setting on. So sorry about that. Hope it doesn't bother you too much. This is what I'm now calling a Veaction, which is just my vegan reaction, but then also, if I want to come in and later add some research to bolster my points, I will. So if there's any weird cuts like that, just be prepared. Anyway, I have never seen this video, so who knows what's gonna happen. It's only 4 minutes long, so hopefully this won't balloon into a million hours. Let's see what he said.
In such circumstances,
I'm sorry, but he's just squinting so hard. Does he have to squint that hard? I mean, I don't know. Good forehead wrinkles definitely add to credibility.
Face of such mandatory privations and manipulations, it's obvious that the last thing our tyrannical, idiot, panicked, virtue-signaling governments should be doing is directing their demented attention toward regulating what people serve at their tables.
Okay, so this is already going more political than I was expecting it to go. You guys sent this to me, and I thought that maybe he's going to get into the dietary information as well. This is more about who should regulate what, and I don't need to get too much into politics here, but I do disagree with Jordan Peterson on a lot of things, and of course I disagree with his daughter Michaela Peterson on her all-carnivore lion diet, which I have responded to in detail in the past, and I will link that below. But I mean, I guess he's a libertarian, so he's saying just like the less the government has to do with anything, the better. We'll leave it at that.
But because meat has also been deemed yet something else that is destroying the planet, the woke narcissists of compassion are already insisting that people eat less of it. Plants and bugs for you and your children, peasants.
Oh my God, plants and bugs. But yeah, people are saying to eat less meat. Is it all narcissists, or is it maybe some public health officials, or like perhaps the WHO and various organizations being like, hey, this is associated with an increased risk of cancer to the point where we're calling it a class 1A carcinogen if it's processed, and if it's red, a class 2A carcinogen, as well as just inflammatory effects, which we can go into the research on, but I want to see what he has to say.
And the sooner you get accustomed to it, or else, the better. Let's turn our attention to the claim that animal husbandry and the meat it produces cheaply enough for everyone to afford is unsustainable. For a moment, because we haven't yet dispensed with enough moralizing and authoritarian stupidity.
Gonna interrupt in mid-sentence there. Yes, about 99% of animals are currently factory farmed. And even if we were to change that, grass-fed ruminants, cows in particular, emit 3 times more methane at least compared to grain-fed animals. And so even where we're at, livestock is a leading global emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, according to the FAO reports. And livestock uses 30% of our ice-free land on the planet and 1/3 of our planet's fresh water. And it's the leading cause of species extinction and deforested at least 80% of the Amazon. But go off, Prof.
Remember what happened the last time that government agencies applied their tender mercy to determining what the people they serve should consume? We were offered the much vaunted food pyramid, telling us to eat
now we're getting there.
6 to 11 servings of grains and carbohydrates a day, with protein and fat at the pinnacle, something to be indulged in with comparative rarity, if indeed necessary at all.
Okay, so I'm realizing right now he's definitely reading something. So he wrote like a little mini essay here, I guess, and now he's reading it off, or he's just looking back and forth in that way.
That all turned out to be wrong. And not just a little wrong, but so wrong.
Okay, cite your researches. Cite your research.
Wrong that it might as well have been not just wrong, but a veritable anti-truth. Something as wrong as it could possibly get.
Okay, it is the case that the food pyramid does have grains on there, and it was made at a time when I think we weren't as aware of how bad refined grains are, so I don't think it made a good distinction. But it's also just worth mentioning that, yeah, the food pyramid is out of date. It's pretty old. But that being said, look into a study like this one on whole grains and mortality. If we're talking about whole grains, this is lowering mortality. This isn't an anti-truth. This is something that can help people live way longer than they otherwise would potentially, and a lot of these populations like the Okinawans traditionally eating, high starch carbohydrate foods and living a very long time. Not an anti-truth. Yeah, maybe eating processed carbohydrates like white rice and stuff and white bread is not going to be good, especially if somebody has diabetes already. We talk about how animal fat, which he's probably going to push really hard in this, is a cause of type 2 diabetes.
The food pyramid was brought into being not least by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That is, by marketers, not scientists or nutritionists, with no shortage whatsoever of lobby efforts by those whose products ended up being promoted.
I mean, that is the situation with the USDA. But we have to emphasize that meat and dairy probably put the most pressure on, as this 1993 paper on the food pyramid mentions. Now, these industries put a lot of pressure on the food pyramid, and quote, since 1977, for example, under pressure from meat producers, federal dietary advice has evolved from decreased consumption of meat to have 2 or 3 daily servings, referring to the food pyramid. And looking at this important document that I don't think he read, the USDA, hires nutritionists. Creating the pyramid actually involved additional testing on nutritionally at-risk children and other individuals. So I'm sure it wasn't Don Draper just doing marketing over there.
The dietary recommendation to prioritize carbohydrates produced a veritable epidemic of obesity and diabetes, resulting in what has been deemed by reliable researchers as one of the worst public health disasters of all time.
Okay, so this is funny because he's blaming, of course, straight up blaming carbs for diabetes, which, we just have to talk about intracellular lipids for a little bit and how saturated animal fat in particular creates those ceramides, which can have toxic effects to your pancreas. And in that sense, they are causally linked to insulin resistance, which is diabetes, essentially. And back to this doc, despite guidelines starting in the early 1900s for the USDA, the first food pyramid wasn't even introduced until 1992, when we were already well on our way toward obesity, doubling the rate of obesity since the 70s. And furthermore, MyPlate was introduced in 2011, replacing the pyramid with grains almost the same size as protein, and obesity continued to climb, so his narrative is not adding up. Anyway, he continues with the diabetes.
Dooming almost the entire Western population to a lifetime of catastrophic chronic health problems. 42.
Okay, so you also even if you were to say that sugar is a cause of type 2 diabetes, you can't just blame sugar either, because of course there's this major sedentary lifestyle, the way that we put highways everywhere and made cities not walkable, and then everyone's, also addicted to various foods that support diabetes as well. And yeah, you can essentially exercise your way out of type 2 diabetes in most cases, but we, of course, are super sedentary. Anyway, keep going.
42% of Americans are obese. Another almost equally large percentage are overweight. At least a third are in the early or later stages of diabetes, which is an exceptionally serious disease.
And then, of course, he's blaming it on carbs. So shouldn't vegans have the highest diabetes rate ever? They eat even more carbs. Oh, wait, the risk of total diabetes from the Adventist studies was 78% lower in vegans. They also had the lowest obesity rate. Again, the 2 issues he's pointing to. And studies like this one, by Mastering Diabetes, that I need to give more attention, is using a particularly high carb vegan diet, and they even lowered obesity severity objectively, with 80% of participants losing weight and 70% lowering hemoglobin A1C, which is that long-term sugar marker. And in the case of 140 people, they averaged diabetic A1C levels at 8% in the beginning, and then after they went down to 6.4, which is averaging not diabetic, which is amazing. Good job, guys, there. And it's also just worth mentioning perhaps the most important factor. He's framing it that carbs, as the government have told you to eat them, have made people way less healthier, and that is what, is killing them. But looking to the diet that he eats, a low-carb diet from meta-analysis after meta-analysis has shown about a 30% increase in mortality by association. So that's pretty much the worst diet out there if you're just trying to live longer. And yet, that anti-truth is lost on him somehow, that he's not saying that.
$1.7 trillion is spent annually on chronic illness in the U.S. And the rise in such illness and cost is directly associated with the beginning of the godforsaken top-down dietary guidelines that set us all on a carbohydrate-heavy dietary pathway.
those godforsaken carbohydrates. Oh my. I mean, this is just, it's just funny how we can just say this stuff with such certainty and just demonize an entire macronutrient with absolutely no research cited, which, I mean, I guess it makes sense if he's more of like a political commentator, I guess. But him and his daughter do make a lot of dietary claims. Let's let him keep going.
There have been, in addition, dozens of studies debunking the claim that red meat causes disease.
You know, he sort of ignores the number one killer here, heart disease, you know, despite saturated fat raising LDL, which, as you know, the European Society of Cardiology, not the US government, says is causal to atherosclerosis, clogging the arteries.
That red meat causes disease. The PURE study, P-U-R-E, published in the journal Lancet in 2017, analyzing 140,000 individuals from 18 countries, revealed that, quote, higher carbohydrate intake, not meat and fat, note, was associated with an increased risk of total mortality, and that, quote, higher saturated fat intake was associated with lower risk of stroke. Lower. That is exactly the opposite of what we have been told.
He's talking about the PURE study, which I've also referred to as the POOR study, because the way that it was executed, and I have an entire video going into all the details on this study in depth, but essentially you're looking at markers of wealth across different nations. For example, saturated fat is something that, you know, is largely in more expensive products, and then carbohydrates are cheaper. They're literally a marker of poverty across the world, which they did some adjusting for. But, you know, for example, in India, the poorest versus richest people die 3 times faster. So you have a major issue that was likely not being adjusted for. Also, the fact that all of these countries that were looked at eat wildly lower saturated fat than us, you know, as low as 6% to 11%. And we also eat way more calories, so more total grams. So the conclusions don't apply to the US, which wasn't included in the study as well. And that study is contradictory to so much more research showing the negative health impacts of meat. And just really quickly for 2 issues that he brought up, meat consumption was associated with almost twice the risk of type 2 diabetes. For a category of people that Jordan Peterson fits, highly educated people in North America. And meat consumption also associated with obesity in the US. So we have to be looking at all of the factors here.
By the beneficial centralizing agents
But he said
who task themselves with determining what we, as sovereign and responsible individuals, should put in our mouths.
It's also worth mentioning, it's a guideline. Like, we have a public health institutions, you know, I'm almost done with Masters in Public Health next semester, finally. And we have public health institutions because they help society out generally. You know, we want to be educating the public, also at least putting some information out there so they're not, you know, drinking and driving and various things like that. This is just another area of health that the government has been like, here are some guidelines. They're not like, you have to eat this way. And yeah, there will be a downstream effect of that, but I don't think people really followed the food pyramid that religiously. More likely factors like advertisers, you know, showing them what to eat, and then those companies having super addictive formulations to foods got people into eating high sodium, high saturated fat, and high sugar foods, which all contribute in a sort of perfect storm to diabetes, as well as being more sedentary as we develop. So like, you're looking at this massive arc of you know, US history, and then pointing to the food pyramid, because the USDA, anyway.
So the health benefits of a pure vegetarian and vegan diet are dubious at best.
Any research? More research?
But what of the argument that animal husbandry is killing the planet? Well, the American Environmental Protection Agency estimates that all farming produces only 11% of greenhouse gases.
So he's so happy to like hit on the government being evil about one thing, but then the moment that it supports the idea that animal agriculture doesn't have a large environmental input, then it's okay.
In the US, transportation produces 27%. Livestock accounts for 3%.
Okay, so this is something that I have done an enormous amount of responding to. I have gone in depth into these figures. I have an entire video on it, several videos on it. And it just doesn't add up if you're actually looking at top down at what we produce and what the emissions per product are. The EPA is just wildly off, and it is, in bed. The government is in bed in many ways with the animal agriculture industry, which is a much bigger industry than the carbohydrate industry, considering that we're growing a huge portion of those carbohydrates to feed animals as well. I mean, we're talking about half of the lower 48 land of the US used for grazing or feeding livestock, according to the USDA. And of course, we have, the beef checkoff, we have the pork board, we have on, egg board, the National Dairy Council, and on. These are huge connections. But then it's okay, to cite the EPA on how small livestock's impact is. No, we're talking about likely, you can check this spreadsheet, I think it's very valid, closer to, that 14, 15, maybe even 18 or so percent, like the FAO has found for the world, which is about 14.5 to 18%, depending on which report it is. That is massive, that is huge, and that is still the US's input after all of these super high emissions that we have with transportation and on. So he's wrong.
And plant-based agriculture? 5%. According to the National Academy of Sciences, if we eradicated all animal-based agriculture, we'd reduce greenhouse gases by a mere 2.6%. And it is no simple matter, by the way, and perhaps impossible, to manage a diet that is sustainable in the medium to long term by merely dining on plants.
I actually am dead right now. It's been 12 years. I'm currently dead. And that is how I'm responding.
Chew on that.
Chew on that. So his way of fighting anti-truth here was really just citing studies that go against the main body of literature, and then using government figures when they were convenient for him, and they made livestock look good, but then rejecting them when they made meat consumption look bad. And then of course just putting way too much credence into the food pyramid for how sick the US is, while completely ignoring the negative health effects of the diet that he eats and promotes, which is of course a type of low-carb diet. I don't know if he's completely on the carnivore diet, his daughter is, or what variation, but the point is low-carb diet's generally associated with about 30% increased all-cause mortality, which, is not the case with vegan diets, and if it was, he probably would have put that statistic in there. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what other points I didn't include, because there was so much more I could have said, but that'll be it for today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.